Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, The Education of Betsey Stockton, with Gregory Nobles. We are in Antiquarian Hall in Worcester with a robust audience watching us virtually on YouTube. And we are located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission here at AAS is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources that AAS has been collecting since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the country and around the world to use our collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like tonight's that feature the fruits of that research and provide insights into the past and its resonance for our own day. Whether you're here in person or with us virtually tonight, welcome to our community of inquiry. We thank you for coming this evening, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you might choose to provide. Thank you. For those of you who are joining us virtually, my colleague Amanda Kondik will be sharing a few notes on how to comment and ask questions in the YouTube chat. She'll also post relevant links and information as the evening goes on YouTube. This program is being recorded, and so it'll be available on our website, on our YouTube channel in a few days. And now I'm happy to introduce Greg Nobles, who is a longtime friend of the American Antiquarian Society. He's Professor Emeritus of History at Georgia Tech. He's also a specialist in early American history and environmental history. In addition to teaching there for many years, he also served in several administrative positions as Associate Dean of the Ivan Allen College, Chair of the School of History, Technology, and Society, and founding director of the Georgia Tech Honors Program. He held 2 Fulbright Fellowships as Senior Scholar in New Zealand and as the John Adams Chair in American History in the Netherlands, and has received numerous research grants from many different organizations and libraries over the years. After retiring from Georgia Tech in 2016, he was the 2016-17 Mellon Distinguished Scholar in Residence right here at the American Antiquarian Society. And then in 2018-19, he was the Robert C. Ritchie Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. His latest books are John James Audubon, The Nature of the American Woodsman. Now, this is the book that last brought him to AAS to speak when it was out in hardcover. It's just out in paperback this week. And the book about which he'll be speaking tonight, which is The Education of Betsey Stockton, An Odyssey of Slavery and Freedom. And before I turn this over to Greg, I want to say a bit about his long connection with the American Antiquarian Society. He was elected a member of AAS in 1995. By that point, he had already done research here a number of times. He was first a fellow here back in 1991. He returned to teach our American Studies seminar in 1998. That's a seminar we offer every fall for undergraduates from 5 different colleges here in the Worcester area. And Greg was telling us earlier this evening that when he taught that seminar, he basically commuted back and forth between Atlanta and Worcester to teach that seminar for a semester. That's dedication to AAS. And he has, of course, been the Mellon Distinguished Scholar in Residence here and has spoken here on many occasions. So it is a delight to welcome Greg Nobles back to AAS to the podium to talk about The Education of Betsey Stockton, which is just out from the University of Chicago Press. Greg, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Scott. That was very kind. And I want to thank Scott for his good stewardship of the society in the last year plus, I think it is. I want to say a few words of thanks to AAS people, some of whom are very dear friends. Dan Wolverton, who is my good friend and former seminar ally, who actually helped arrange this event, to Amanda Kondik in the rear, who is making it happen, and also to Nate Fisk for the technical assistance, which is always a source of anxiety to me, so I'm very, very grateful to have that. And thanks to all of you here tonight and all of you on YouTube enjoying the comfort of your own computers. And for those of you who might be watching this sometime in the future, because it's going to be taped, I hope to be around with you. That'll be just fine. No, it is wonderful to be here. And Scott talked about my many forms of connection to AAS, and they've all been delightful. They've all been absolutely delightful, and I have a great affection for this place. It's a very welcoming place. It's really become my favorite place to do research. And so when I got to come here in 2016, 2017 as the Mellon Fellow, it was just a great start for a good project. And I began to work just right down the hall in the reading room, almost 6 years to the day in October of 2016. And that year, from October of 2016 to June of 2017, was a remarkable time for me, almost a magical time. So once again, thank you, AAS. Thank you, Mellon Foundation, wherever you are. And this is the woman I want to talk about tonight, Betsy Stockton. This is the only photograph we have of her, the only image we have. It's taken when she was in her early to mid 60s. So you'll have to get used to it. It appears various times. You'll have to imagine her younger, perhaps, when I talk a little bit later. But she's one of those obscure figures in history, but I think also a very fascinating figure, remarkable figure. She's someone I think deserves a much more visible place in history. And that's what I've tried to do in this book, is to bring her into history, to give her that kind of visibility that I think she deserves. Now, when I got here and started the research on this project, I knew the basic outlines of her life. I knew the basic outlines of her story, and I'll give you a very, very brief version of that outline now. And I'll welcome your questions during the Q&A session, should you have them. And please do bear with me, because I'm going a quick overview, and I'll be moving at a rapid rate just to give you some quick tour of her life. She was born here in 1798 or 1798 question mark, because we're not sure exactly of the time of her birth. She was born into slavery on the estate of Robert Stockton of Princeton, one of the most powerful figures in Princeton in the 18th century. But Stockton, like most slaveholders, did not issue a birth certificate or tell us exactly when she was born, or frankly, to whom. This is his estate at Constitution Hill in Princeton. And we assume that Betsy's birth mother was one of the enslaved women at Constitution Hill. Probably, as I discuss in the book, a woman named Celia, but again, probably becomes an important word here. The man involved was probably one of the men on Stockton's estate, probably one of his sons. He had 3 sons. In fact, during the course of writing, I got a number of emails from Stockton descendant, and she was very interested in which Stockton son it might be. And I had no idea. Frankly, neither did she, but she guessed it would be a particular one, Job Stockton, because she said he was a little bit odd. I have no idea. But Betsy Stockton is born at Constitution Hill on the Stockton estate, but then sometime before 1804, she's given to Robert Stockton's daughter, Elizabeth Stockton Green, another Betsy Stockton, but this is the Stockton from Robert's family. And Elizabeth Stockton Green is the wife of the Reverend Ashbel Green, a very, very prominent figure in the Presbyterian Church. He is Princeton class of 1783. He moves on to become the pastor at the Second Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, one of the most prestigious churches. He's also becomes the chaplain to the American Congress, the U.S. Congress, when it sits there. Ashbel Green is an important figure. So important, he was elected to membership at AAS in 1814. So that's an indication of something. And I ask you to keep Ashbel Green in mind, because he's a constant. He's a very significant figure in Betsy Stockton's life up until the end of his life in 1848. Now, Ashbel Green is uneasy, at least by his own admission, about being a slaveholder. And so at some point, he emancipates Betsy, young Betsy, from slavery. It maybe was as early as 1807 when his wife dies, Elizabeth Stockton Green. It might have been as late as 1810 when the Philadelphia census shows there's no enslaved person in Ashbel Green's household. But emancipating her from slavery, if that's when it happens, and again, there's another probably there, doesn't mean that she is completely free. He still keeps her in some form of unfreedom, probably as an indentured servant or a person with some kind of obligation to him. And he keeps her in his household for another 10 years, at least, actually more than that, up until 1822. And I will note, and this is something perhaps we can discuss a bit more in the Q&A session, that both Pennsylvania, where Green first acquires Betsy in his house, and then later Princeton in New Jersey, both of those states have gradual abolition laws, and they're very, very gradual. They don't require anybody to be set free immediately. But it does create a situation in which some slaveholders begin to look at their enslaved people and begin to think about emancipation is coming, maybe I ought to do something. And I think Green actually might be one of those people. Anyway, Betsy Stockton lives in Ashbel Green's household in Philadelphia until 1812, and then in 1812, he becomes president of the College of New Jersey, or more commonly called Princeton, and there it is. The house on the right is the president's house, and that's where Ashbel Green lives, along with Betsy Stockton. She's part of his household there. But then in 1813, he sells her. Or he sells 3 years of her time. I make a distinction. He's not selling her body, he's selling her time. Sells her to another Presbyterian pastor down in Woodbury, New Jersey, which is down just across from Philadelphia. It's hard to see on that map, but trust me, it's there. But then in 1816, she comes back to Princeton, comes back to Ashbel Green, and then stays with him until 1822, at which point she joins a group of missionaries sponsored by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. I got that one right. Leaving New Haven in November of 1822 on a whale ship called the Thames, which is the way they pronounce it in Connecticut, the Thames. And she's somewhere in that picture. I don't know. This is just a kind of a woodcut. This is, of course, before photography. But she goes on the whaling ship, the Thames, around Cape Horn, out to the Pacific, and finally to the Hawaiian Islands. Winds up eventually on Maui at a missionary station in Lahaina, where she becomes a teacher and part of the missionary family, the missionary community. She also becomes very close, exceedingly close to a married couple on board the ship with her, on board the Thames, Charles Samuel Stewart and Harriet Bradford Tiffany Stewart. Charles Stewart is another Ashbel Green connection. He was one of Green's undergraduate students at Princeton. He goes on to the Princeton Theological Seminary. And when he decides to go off on the mission to the Sandwich Islands, as it's called at the time, to Hawaii, he comes back with Betsy Stockton, both of them planning to go away, and has this very tearful meeting with Ashbel Green. And Ashbel Green says, that's it. They're going east, I'm going west. We'll never see each other again. But they do. They do. But after they've been in Maui for a couple of years, Harriet Stewart becomes very ill. And so it's determined that the best thing for her is to leave Hawaii, to go back to the U.S. So they go via London for a few weeks and then back to Cooperstown, New York, where Harriet Stewart is from. Betsy Stockton spends a couple of years there in Cooperstown with the Stewarts. Then she gets a job offer in Philadelphia at an infant school. And I'll explain a bit more about those perhaps later. An infant school really is rather akin to our version of Head Start. And that is, it's a school for 2 to 5-year-olds. And Betsy Stockton is the principal teacher in that school. She has one assistant and about 100 students. Wow. So you can imagine. You can imagine. She does that for a couple of years. She takes a brief detour up to Grape Island in Ontario, where she starts another school for Indigenous children in that community, comes back to Philadelphia, and finally winds up in Princeton in 1833. And that's where she spends the rest of her life until 1865, when she dies at the age of 67. She doesn't stay in Princeton in death, though. She's a leader in the community. She's a very important figure. But when she dies, she's requested to go back to Cooperstown and be buried in the Stewart family plot. And that's where she is. That's where she's been since 1865. The tombstone you see there has fallen over. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but she's part of the Stewart family burial site. Well, that's the overview. That's the summary. I mean, it sounds almost exhausting. It's exhausting for me to tell you. It's probably exhausting for you to hear from me. I think it almost must have been exhausting for Betsy Stockton to have lived all the travel. But again, I think it's a remarkable life. She goes from Princeton to the Pacific and back again, and all these various stops, but finally stopping in Princeton for the last 30 plus years of her life. My friend David Blight tells us in his wonderful biography of Frederick Douglass that Douglass was probably the most well-traveled black man in the 19th century in America. I think Betsy Stockton might well have been the most well-traveled black woman in antebellum America, certainly for a woman born into slavery. There she is again. I'll leave her out. Well, there you have it. That's the basic outline. That's what I knew when I started research here at AAS on Betsy Stockton's story. But what I didn't know at the time, and what I couldn't really know at the time, was what to make of Betsy Stockton as a person. Not just where did she go, I could figure that out. And not just what did she do, but really what was she like. And the question for me was what to make of her. What to make of her place in history, if there was one, or how to write her history. And that was a challenge I faced when I began work on this project. Now, part of that challenge came from the scarcity of sources. Betsy Stockton did not leave us a lot in terms of papers, in terms of personal papers. There's a journal that she wrote on her voyage on the whale ship to Hawaii. That was published, and it's still available to us, thank you. But beyond that, we have a couple of letters, her last will and testament from 1862, a few other scraps, but they really are scraps. There's not very much. There's no Betsy Stockton archive, no trove of documents written by her, although I keep waiting for them to come down sometime, and I'll rewrite the book, perhaps. But I think that's an important point, though, because it's a common problem. It's a common problem for people writing, especially about African Americans and people of color. Most of our archival sources, including the ones here, tend to come from white people and especially white males. Archival sources for people of color are very rare and hard to come by. And Betsy Stockton is one of those people. So the question facing me and the question facing other people who are going to write on folks like Betsy Stockton is, well, what do you do? How do you go about it? How do you find out anything? Well, you learn to take the scraps you can get. You learn to take what your subject can tell you and to make of them what you can. And so in looking at Betsy Stockton and reading her journal, reading her letters, I've tried to get some sense of her personality, of her concerns, her intellect, and frankly, her sense of humor. And one has to extrapolate from that, not just from the time it's written, but over time. But you also learn to read with skepticism. That is, you read what other people might have written about her. And there's actually quite a bit of that. But you have to read it sometimes a bit against the grain, to raise questions, to see if perhaps what a person, a particularly white person, said about her might be read somewhat differently, and therefore might give us a different sort of information. And the point is always you have to be aware of the larger historical context in which she's operating. And I want to offer a couple of examples of that tonight. I want to go back to that point I mentioned a moment ago in 1812 when Betsy Stockton joins Ashbel Green going to Princeton, living in the president's house. But then in 1813, he sells her. He sells her away, sells her time and sends her away. And why did he do that? Why did he do that? He later wrote that he did it really for her own good, and I think for his own good as well. He said that she was till the age of 13 or 14 wild and thoughtless, if not vicious, and he thought getting her out of his household would be good for her, to save her from, as he said, the snares and temptations of the city. he was living in Princeton, New Jersey at the time, so it's not quite a city, but nonetheless, he's trying to get her out. And there's a case where we have to read the evidence differently. Was she really wild and thoughtless and vicious and so forth? Well, in 1813, she's probably 15 years old. She's a teenager who's been taken from her birth mother. She's been given to a white pastor and his wife in Philadelphia. She's kept there as a slave and then as a servant, again, in some kind of unfree capacity. And she's still subject to Ashbel Green's authority. And so, yes, maybe she was unhappy with that. Maybe she was resistant to Ashbel Green. But then I think about Ashbel Green himself. He's a college president, which sounds like a lofty position, but in his telling, it was not that at all. He's surrounded and frankly hounded by undergraduate students, boys, most of them not much older than Betsy herself, and boys who engage in all sorts of antisocial, anti-Ashbel, frankly, behaviors, making fun of him, setting off explosives, burning down the college privy. This is always a big concern of his. Well, he can't get rid of all of them, but he can get rid of Betsy, and he does. So he sends her way down to Woodbury, New Jersey, sells 3 years of her time to another Presbyterian pastor, a man named Nathaniel Todd, and Betsy Stockton lives with Todd for 3 years and his wife. It's actually an interesting experience because Todd is not only a pastor, he runs a school, and she's able to benefit from the books in his study, just as she's benefited from reading the books in Ashbel Green's study. And then she goes back to Princeton. Whoops, quick. Time's up from the Todd. The 3 years that he sold is over. Nathaniel Todd drifts off to somewhere in Pennsylvania, and Betsy Stockton comes back to Princeton, back to Ashbel Green's house. And now, aged 18 or so, she joins the church, the Presbyterian Church, which is the church in Princeton. And she's deemed to be display good conduct by the session, and so they admit her to membership. They accept her as a full member while she's living in the house of Ashbel Green once again. By the way, I have to pause here and say this is the first time in the church record that I've seen Betsy and Stockton together, her full name. That's the first time that Stockton appears. Ashbel Green always refers to as Betsy, Betty, but never with the last name. And I think that she took the Stockton name for herself. It was a case of self-naming, which was common, of course, among enslaved people who had gained their freedom. So she's back in Princeton in 1816. She's a member of the church. She's living in Ashbel Green's household. But again, in terms of the context, this is also Princeton in 1816. Another young woman, about the same age, is being offered for sale. And this time by a member of the Princeton faculty, Elijah Slack, one of Ashbel Green's colleagues. And that's Princeton in the 18 teens. That's Betsy Stockton and her teens. And so, yes, she can be a member of Ashbel Green's household again. She can be a member of the church. She can sit in the pew in the balcony with all the other black people. But she can also read the paper. And she knows what it's like to have been sold herself. She knows what can happen to a young black woman like herself. And again, this is nothing that she comments on, but I think it has to be in her awareness, somewhere in the back of her mind. There's another wonderful bit of evidence from the 18 teens, and I have to say, sometimes as a researcher, especially here, you get enormously lucky. People at AAS like to talk about the miracle of the dome, and I had a wonderful miracle happen in, I think, October, early November of 2016. One morning I was sitting quietly, I hope, at my desk. Ellen Dunlap, the former president, Scott's predecessor, came by and said really kind of casually, there's a member of AAS who lives in Princeton, New Jersey, a guy named Joseph Falcone. He's a rare book dealer, deals in New Jerseyana. And, he has a book that has Betsy Stockton's signature in the flyleaf. She said, you might want to go down there. I said, might? Are you kidding? I got in touch with Joe Falcone right away. I got myself down to Princeton. And there on the third floor office with his wonderful collection of books was this. The Flowers of Literature by Thomas Brannigan. But as advertised, as promised in the flyleaf, there was Betsy Stockton's signature. He let me hold it in my hands. And there it was. I was holding in my hands the book she had held in her hands 200 years before, with her, and it had her name in it. And I don't know when she got it, probably 1816, 1817, 18, when she was back in New Jersey. How did she get it? I don't know. It might have been a gift. She might have bought it with her own money. But the point is, she had it. She had it. She put her name in it. And I think we all know, when you write your name in a book, that's a sign of possession. This is my book. And here was an act of possession on the part of a woman who had been considered a possession herself. And I think this is a very striking moment here. Well, okay, so I thanked Joe Falcone profusely, got back to AAS, went back into the reading room, thought maybe I should look into this Thomas Brannigan guy and see something about him. And so I did what every scholar does. I Googled him. And it turned out that the leading authority on Thomas Brannigan was at the next table over. Chris Phillips of Lafayette College, a wonderful guy, one of my fellow potluck dinner companion. So we had lunch. We talked about Thomas Brannigan. We talked about Brannigan, who's an interesting character. We talked about some of Brannigan's books, and we talked a bit about The Flowers of Literature. Now, I have to tell you, I read The Flowers of Literature. It is not a great read. I don't think it's a great book. It's a compendium of world and biblical history, a little bit of mythology thrown in. It's a useful kind of reference book. But, and here's the point about The Flowers of Literature, it has a very compelling preface, one that I think would have appealed to Betsy Stockton at the time she possessed this book. Brannigan has a preface in which he begins by writing to parents, and he gives parents the expected line: take care of your children's souls. That's your job as a parent. He writes to children: you're born to die, which is a form of discipline, I suppose, for them. But after those stern messages to parents and children, he writes to teachers. And he says, you have a remarkable responsibility to the young. You can actually save them through education. You can do this. And I tried to read that as I thought Betsy Stockton might have read it at the time she got the book. That appeal, that challenge to teachers, comes at a time when Betsy Stockton is herself beginning to think about becoming a teacher. Now, I don't know that from Betsy Stockton herself, but we do know it from a young man, a student at the Princeton Theological Seminary named Michael Osborne, who writes her a letter of recommendation. And he knew Stockton from church. She was in his Sunday school class. And he writes about her emerging commitment to education. He writes about her own education, how she had taught herself to read, mostly, again, by working in Ashbel Green's library, and his sons perhaps helping her learn, not Ashbel Green himself. But she learns not just the ABCs, not just the 3 R's. She had become quite sophisticated in her reading, and she had developed a deep knowledge of literature and theology. She was a very sophisticated and voracious reader. In fact, I argue in the book, she was not just literate, she was an intellectual. And there are times when she's, for instance, on the whale ship going to the Pacific, and she's quoting Milton out of her head. She's quoting parts of the Bible. She knew this stuff by heart. There was not a library on board the whale ship, let me assure you. But Michael Osborne, this young theological student, also notes that Betsy Stockton is becoming committed to becoming a teacher. She wants to teach black children in Princeton, but there's no opportunity for that. So she wants to teach children elsewhere, somewhere. And that's when she decides to become a missionary. And that's what becomes Betsy Stockton's calling, as a missionary, but also as a teacher. Well, that's fine. It might seem kind of benign seeming, but it's not so easy. Not so easy to take that for granted, especially when we're talking about a young black woman in New Jersey. Nobody asked her to become a teacher. Nobody trained her. She never went to school a day in her life. She never really had a role model, what a good teacher is. And I think also she had to know, even as a teenager, that her options in life were very limited if she stayed in Princeton, New Jersey. In Princeton, most black women worked as domestics or washers and ironers, washerwomen, that kind of thing. There are no black teachers in the town, no opportunities for a well-read woman like Betsy Stockton to become a teacher. So, on one level, I think becoming a missionary might be the best way to do the work that she felt called to do. And so there was a spiritual quest behind that. But I think also becoming a missionary might be a way for her to get out of Princeton, out of New Jersey, out of the United States, out of a racist society in which she had been born into slavery and still faced very, very limited opportunities. At any rate, she says farewell to Ashbel Green. She says goodbye to Princeton. She goes to New Haven, gets on the whale ship, sails off to the Pacific, winds up in the Hawaiian Islands, and there she is. But I have to say, that's not an easy choice. It's a critical choice. It's a watershed moment in her life, but one I think, again, cannot be simply taken for granted. And so, yeah, she goes off to the Pacific, to the Hawaiian Islands, and then back to the U.S., back to Cooperstown, back to Philadelphia. All of those important chapters in her life, and I hope important chapters in my book, and I'll be happy to talk about them. But I do want to point out that when I talk about the Odyssey of Betsy Stockton, I want to be clear about what I mean by that term. Quite often we use Odyssey as a sort of throwaway term for a long journey. And that's fine. But I think I like to use it the way Homer used it in talking about Odysseus. And that is not just a long journey. It's a long journey filled with threats and dangers. And it's those threats and dangers that Betsy Stockton faced throughout her life. Growing up in Princeton, in the other places she goes, out to the Pacific, to Philadelphia, back to Princeton. But I always want to keep those dangers in mind, that context. So that's why I want to jump ahead a few years to 1833, when she comes back to Princeton. She comes back to Princeton, back to where she had been born in 1798, where she had lived in the household of Ashbel Green in the 18 teens, where she would live as the unmarried matriarch of the black community in Princeton for the rest of her life until she dies in October of 1865. And so the question is, what role does Princeton play in this Odyssey? What do we need to know about Betsy Stockton's Princeton from the 1830s to the 1860s? Well, to some, Princeton might seem like an idyllic place on the surface. It still does, frankly. It's a nice-looking town, handsome town, a bucolic-seeming community, and one that has a very prominent college. But I think this image of the college is instructive. I want to take a moment to deconstruct it if I can. That's Nassau Hall, the main college building at Princeton, always has been since the 18th century. But you can see the walkway coming out of the door of Nassau Hall. It becomes a walkway. It crosses Nassau Street, which is where you see the people in the carriage and the little kid rolling the hoop. And then it becomes another street, Witherspoon Street. And that's the street that goes into Princeton's black community. That was the case in the 19th century. It's the case still in the 21st century. In fact, I sometimes talk about Princeton as a tale of two streets, Nassau Street and Witherspoon Street, the intersection of race and class, the academic side on one, the black side on the other. So yeah, the college was prominent. The college was prominent, but the college was also a problem, especially for members of the black community. Princeton had long pursued a particular recruitment strategy, what I call a Southern strategy. They tried to get young boys from the South. They knew they couldn't compete with Harvard and Yale for Northern students, so they tried to recruit from Southern states along with New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and they did quite well at that. They started this in the 18th century, and by the 19th century, about half the student body was from below the Mason-Dixon line. And that student body had a profound effect upon the college, and I think actually on the larger community of the town. Those Southern students, and I think also some faculty members, likewise from the South, gave the college a Southern accent of sort, I call it. They influenced the political tone of the college. and by extension, by radiation almost, the political tone of the community, at least the white community. And throughout the antebellum era, white students from the college attacked anti-slavery advocates, black and white. There are a number of cases of that. They attacked black people, men and women, a number of cases of that. I recount a number of examples of this violent behavior in my book, and it's frankly quite ugly. But that's the obvious side of racist behavior in Princeton. There's another side, too, another less violent form of racist behavior, and one of the most obvious comes from the Presbyterian Church. Again, the Presbyterian Church, which is shown on the left, this is now called Nassau Presbyterian, was the church in town. It was connected to the college. All the prominent people went there. It's the church that Betsy Stockton joined in 1816. It's the one she returned to in 1833, again, renewing her membership there. But within a few years, it's also a college that became a church that became segregated by its own decision. On July 6, 1835, the Presbyterian Church burned to the ground. It was a long July 4th weekend. Somebody shot a rocket. It landed on the roof. The roof caught fire. The church burned down, and that was it. It was destroyed. But in the process of rebuilding, some of the Presbyterian leaders, again, including some of those from the South, particularly from Virginia, decided they were going to make a change, that the new church would be a whites-only congregation. And they urged the black people who had been in the church, over 100 people, both enslaved and free blacks, to go off and form a congregation of their own. They'd be better off doing that, the notion was. Well, the black Presbyterians didn't ask for that. They didn't want that. They resisted. They tried to argue against it. They wanted to stay part of the original church, but the white Presbyterians prevailed. And so in 1846, some 92 black Presbyterians, including Betsy Stockton, with her name at the top of the list, formed their own church, the First Presbyterian Church of Color, it was called. 1848, it changes its name to Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, and it's still called that today. My point here is it was not a breakaway congregation. It was a push-away congregation. It was done by the white congregation to the black congregation. But it becomes a critical part, a critical institution in Princeton's black community, perhaps the critical institution of the black community. And it's a congregation in which Betsy Stockton plays a critical role in educating that community, both children and adults. In the 1840s and 50s, she becomes a very prominent teacher in the Sunday school. Now that sounds sort of innocuous on the surface, teaching a Sunday school, but she wasn't just teaching Bible verses. She was teaching literacy. That very valuable tool, so long denied to black people, North and South. It's one of those tools you don't really notice except when you don't have it. And by providing it to the people in the church, she was making, I think, a very important contribution, not just to their spirituality, not just to their eternal salvation, but to the here and now. And she doesn't teach just children. She begins later on teaching adults as well in a night class. She's spreading the gospel of literacy throughout the black community. I think that's a very, very important step for her. And she does it not just on Sunday, she does it Monday through Friday as well. She becomes the founding teacher of Princeton's only public school for black children. She is the only teacher in that school from 1837 until, again, 1865. Princeton's a town that celebrates education. That's part of the Princeton brand, if you will. Celebrates education for white people anyway. There's the college. There's the Princeton Theological Seminary. There are any number of private academies for boys and girls. There are any number of parochial schools. There are a host of educational institutions, but not much in the way of public education. In the late 1840s, the local school superintendent writes that the one public school for white children has this on-again, off-again status. Can't always get a teacher, so there's not always school for the children to attend. The black school, though, he says, is different. It's consistently open. under the care, he says, of Betsy Stockton, formerly a missionary to the Sandwich Islands. And that identity with her missionary work in the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, stays with her throughout her life. It's only a 2-year chapter, but it's how she's known throughout her life. She has about 45 students enrolled in the school. She teaches them the basics, the 3 R's. But again, those 3 R's, reading and writing and arithmetic, are tools, and they're critical. It's what children need to make it, what they need to make it to survive in this racially hostile town, to be on any kind of equal footing with white people. And she's the one who, generation after generation, is providing those tools. And again, the context matters. One example, 1858. Princeton, a town that's done so little for public education, determines to do better. The voters approve funds for public school improvements. And that's great. That's great. They provide $6,000 for building a new public school for white children. $50 for Betsy Stockton's black school. Less than 1%. Separate, you bet. Equal, not by any means. And again, that was Princeton. That's the context. That's part of her Odyssey, living and being part of that community. Well, again, Betsy Stockton kept teaching until the day she died on October 24th, 1865. In 1860, the census taker, a man named Eli Stonecker, comes around to her house and he interviews Betsy Stockton, as census takers do. And he writes down under occupation, teacher. She's the only black person in Princeton with that title. The census also shows that she's living alone. She has no family of her own, no husband, no children. And we can perhaps speculate why that is. I will welcome, in fact, your speculation. Was it perhaps a commitment to her calling? Was it perhaps a desire for independence without the burden of a husband? Was it a question of her sexuality? Could it be all three? It's very hard to know. But in a sense, the whole black community of Princeton was her family. And this title of teacher was the central element of her identity in Princeton, certainly in the black community. And after she died, people talked about how she carried herself with a kind of regal dignity throughout the town, and everybody had to respect that, especially in a town where she'd been born into slavery. Well, I want to close with one last consideration, one question that has multiple parts, I have to confess. The question is, how do we locate Betsy Stockton in history? Or how do we locate her in historical memory? And I want to be clear about how I see Betsy Stockton. She wasn't an outspoken orator for abolition like Frederick Douglass. She wasn't an outspoken advocate for women's rights like Sojourner Truth. She wasn't a heroic liberator like Harriet Tubman. And all those people, those three people deserve their special place in the pantheon of antebellum protests for black people. And yeah, like those figures who traveled so much around the United States, Betsy Stockton traveled a great deal in the first half of her life. But in the second half, she stayed in one place and did one thing. She spent the last half of her life helping build and sustain institutions, the church and the school, the two most important institutions in black communities in antebellum America, one might argue still. She helps build and sustain those institutions in Princeton, and she does it day after day, year after year, always in this context of racism that pervaded Princeton, that pervaded the North, that pervaded all of America. And I do have to point out sometimes in talking to friends and colleagues and students, this notion that the North is the land of the free and the South is the land of slavery is a great mistake. We have to see racism in the North in its different context, perhaps, but we have to see it nonetheless. And that's the context in which Betsy Stockton lived and spent her life. I argue in the book that her persistence in doing that teaching and institution building day after day, that persistence was a form of resistance. And my point in the book, and my point this evening, is that that sort of dogged, day-to-day grassroots effort needs to be acknowledged. It needs somehow to count in history. People in Princeton's black community know that quite well. They've known it for over a century. She's been part of that community's memory since the day she died. If you happen to go to Princeton and go down to the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, here's one of the windows in the church, presented by the scholars of Elizabeth Stockton. And the scholars are not academics from college. They are her students from Sunday school and her regular public school. If you go to the church, there's also a plaque inside the church. A little hard to read here, perhaps, but a teacher of youth, a powerful influence for good in the community. The Witherspoon Presbyterian Church commissioned in 1999 this painting of Betsy Stockton, kind of going back in time in her Hawaiian garb. It now hangs in the library at the Princeton Theological Seminary, but you can go see it there. And out in front of the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church is this plaque placed by the Women's Heritage Trail in 2004 about the life of Betsy Stockton. So anybody walking through the black community in Princeton today can come upon that. Well, that's the black community in Princeton. The academic community has now begun of late to take some notice of her. And I have to say a word here in recognition, frankly, in admiration and honor of the Princeton Slavery Project, established by my friend and Princeton professor Marty Sandweiss, also a member of AAS, about almost 10 years ago. And what she's done, working with very little institutional support, has been to bring students and faculty together, scholars from both Princeton and elsewhere, to provide documents and essays. And now the Princeton Slavery website has some 900 pages worth of materials on the nature of race and slavery in the college and, frankly, in the larger community. I think it's a very important effort and one that I'm enormously proud to be part of, with an essay on Betsy Stockton, but even more proud of Marty Sandweiss for the work she's done. In 2018, it was back in the 19th century, Princeton created the Elizabeth Betsy Stockton Garden. It's out in front of the library and right close to Nassau Street, if you know the geography. They've also put a plaque on the Alumni House. I mentioned the President's House in Princeton back in an earlier slide. It's now the Alumni House, but it's where the early presidents of Princeton lived. And the first 9 presidents of Princeton were slaveholders, Ashbel Green being the 8th. And so they've listed on this plaque, and I know you can't read it, the names of all those enslaved people who were kept in that house. It's a reminder to the community. It's a reminder to, I think, the whole campus community, especially, of what had happened before. 2 years ago, in 2021, the Princeton Theological Seminary established the Betsy Stockton Center for Black Church Studies, and they now have a wonderful, wonderful director who's leading that. In Hawaii, there's a historic reenactor at the Hawaiian Mission House's historic site. And she will give a 20-minute spiel as Betsy Stockton. It's kind of fun to watch. And another Hawaiian, or at least former Hawaii resident, has written about Betsy Stockton, this in 2020. And what Barack Obama does here is to call attention, yes, to Betsy Stockton's intellect, to her piety, but also to her hope. And this is, Obama always is looking for hope. And I join him in being hopeful, too. I'm hopeful that maybe there'll be more work done on Betsy Stockton. I would welcome more books, novels, poems. I've heard that up in Cooperstown, New York, the Glimmerglass Opera is thinking about writing an opera about Betsy Stockton. Love to see that. Maybe even, who knows, a movie. But I hope more to come, not just about Betsy Stockton, but about other people as well. People who, like her, have stories that haven't yet been told, but need to be told and can be told. And I think, frankly, in my most hopeful days, will be told, perhaps by researchers who, like me, began their work right here at AAS. Thank you very much.
Well, Thank you so much, Greg. And now we have some time for questions. So I invite those of you who are here in our audience in Antiquarian Hall to raise your hand. I'll bring the mic over to you. Amanda will also be fielding questions that come in on YouTube. We'll start with Dan.
Wonderful. Any indication of why she left Maui and came back to the mainland?
Yes. She had become very close to the two people whose photographs I showed, Charles Samuel Stewart and his wife Harriet. It's a friendship that developed on board the ship while they were sailing there. She actually helped deliver the Stewart's first child and become enamored of him. But while they were there, Harriet became sick. And Betsy Stockton herself had periodically been sick in the islands. And so it was determined that the thought was at the time, the best cure for this is to get women back to cold climates, get them out of the tropics. And so after some toing and froing, after some heartfelt conversations, the Stewarts decided that they needed to leave. They needed to go back to America. And at that time, their relationship with Betsy Stockton had become so close. She had become almost a member of their family. In fact, now in death, she is a member of their family. She's buried. So when the Stewarts decide they have to go, she goes with them. And in doing so, frankly, leaves behind an expectation because that she would be in the islands forever. When people left to go as missionaries to the Pacific Islands, they thought it was a one-way ticket. You wouldn't come back. And yet it was rare that they did, but she did. And, there's an alternative story. What if she had stayed there for the next 30 years? I have no idea. But I know what happened when she came back eventually to Princeton.
When she was a young teenager, why do you think Ashbel Green said such negative things about her?
Because he's Ashbel Green. That's not an answer. Well, I think that there are two ways of looking at it. One, yes, maybe she's a teenager, and teenagers sometimes are like that. But I think also Green, as I suggested, might be projecting some of his own anxieties as this man, college president, beset by these unruly students onto her. And so I think that it's hard for us to tell because she doesn't write about her own behavior. She doesn't write about her childhood at all. I will say the first time Betsy Stockton enters the historical record is in 1804, September of 1804. Ashbel Green writes in his diary, Bet played the mischief. Now, she's 6 years old at the time. That's what 6-year-olds do. The next day, he writes, corrected Bet. He doesn't say what corrected meant. It might have been verbal admonition. It might have been physical abuse. I don't know. But I do know that Ashbel Green, when he, later on, when he does sell Betsy Stockton off to this other Presbyterian pastor, he buys the time of two other young teenage black people. And one of them, a young man named John, he writes in his diary, whipped John several times. Ashbel Green is a man with a temper. He's a benign figure in some of the tellings, but I think there's another side to Ashbel Green. And so when I read his words about Betsy Stockton, I have to take them with a proverbial grain of salt, to read against the grain of what he's writing.
Amanda?
Great. Thank you, Scott. So Ashley Cataldo asks, what advice do you have for historians trying to read against the grain of, and for instance, a massive archive like that of the ABCFM? And could you ever begin a project like yours with records like those produced by organizations like the ABCFM?
I think it's always good to read against the grain, no matter what the documents, to ask what they say and then to think differently about what they might mean. Are there different meanings that might not be intended by the author? And I think, frankly, with an organization like the ABCFM, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, they have a particular story to tell about themselves. They have a particular way to justify their own existence. And so I think it's important to, take what they write seriously, but not always literally. And would I ever do it with a set of documents like that? Having scratched around to find whatever documents I could, I guess I would welcome that. But I'm much more intrigued by this process than that, frankly.
Do we have any evidence of her indentured servant contract, and if like her masters or not slave masters would have any recourse if they broke that as a free slave?
There's nothing I've been able to find. And here's where Ashbel Green, I think, is at fault, living in Philadelphia. If you have enslaved people, you're supposed to register them. If you set them free, you're supposed to tell the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And I went through reels and reels of tape from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. No Ashbel Green, no Betsy Stockton. When Betsy Stockton is about to go off on this mission with the ABCFM, Ashbel Green writes what amounts to a work contract for her and says she can do this, but she's not supposed to do menial labor. She's supposed to help out with the family, the Stewart family, help out with teaching, but not to become basically a maid. Her contract with the ABCFM says that she is to be considered neither equal nor servant, but an honored Christian friend. I don't know what that means, but that's what they said about her.
Like we all know Betsy. Is this working?
It's on.
Oh, you
It's
got
on.
a question?
It's on.
Oh, it's on. Yeah. Just maybe, I'm just curious though, maybe superfluous. Did you ever research what her cause of death was?
I don't know, but I do know that she was ill a lot of her life. When she was going to the Sandwich Islands, one of her colleagues said she was spitting up blood from time to time. One of the few letters we have written by her, again to Charles Samuel Stewart in 1845, she talks about being cold and miserable and unhappy, and could he send her some, warm rugs for her floors. I don't know the exact cause of death. Maybe it'd be something like consumption, but there was no death record that said what she died of. And she was 67 years old, which at the time was not young for women in the 19th century.
Green went to 86 or so.
Yes.
Amanda?
All right, thank you, Scott. So Amy Hurley asks, can you talk about why her gravestone has fallen?
Yeah, neglect. It fell over. However, I will say that people in Cooperstown at the Lakeside Cemetery got a grant from New York State to raise it back up. So if you go there now, it's standing up. At least I think it is. But, gravestones do that. I don't think it was necessarily vandalized or pushed over, but it had fallen and had been lying in the mud with grass growing over it for years, frankly. But again, it's one of those moments in this kind of rediscovery of Betsy Stockton that led them to get a grant to put that stone back up. And I'm happy to see that it is.
Great. We have another question here from Ken Johnston. So do you know if there were any abolitionists associated with the Black Presbyterian Church she attended in Princeton? The Underground Railroad was very active in the areas around Princeton.
Yes, there were. There was. In fact, there were two black pastors in the 1840s, early 50s. One of them, Charles Gardner, a man who I think has received not enough attention, had come up from Philadelphia. He was a member of the Philadelphia Vigilant Committee, basically the Underground Railroad Committee in Philadelphia. He was a very strong abolitionist, a very strong anti-colonizationist, and he was at the church for just a couple of years because he got crosswise with some people from the Theological Seminary who were inserting themselves into the running of the church, and so finally he left. So I think, and then actually, one of the most important pastors at Witherspoon Church is William Drew Robeson, Father Paul Robeson. And Robeson was run out of the church by the New Brunswick Presbyterian. Not a very happy story. But I do speculate that in 1906, when the plaque was placed in the Witherspoon Presbyterian Church, Paul Robeson it was just before his 8th birthday, he was there. I like to think of Paul Robeson sitting there looking up. There was a stained glass window honoring his grandmother. There was a stained glass window 2 windows down honoring Betsy Stockton. Robeson had to see that. And Robeson, of course, called Princeton a Jim Crow town. He was no fan of that community. But I think he had known about, he must have heard about Betsy Stockton.
I really admired the way you wrote this book, interweaving all of the scraps that you were able to find, even though there wasn't that much like from Betsy herself. And I was wondering if it was a challenge for you to write without letting those other stories like overshadow her.
Yeah, it was a challenge. And I think that's one of the dangers because there's so much information about the larger context. I could have written more and more chapters about Ashbel Green, about Princeton as a town, about the whole missionary effort, and yet I tried to keep Betsy Stockton in my mind. You don't want to go more than 2 pages without seeing her name. that's sort of my standard here. But yeah, the context here can become kind of overwhelming, and so I think one of the challenges was to hold some of that off and try to remember it's about her, not just about them.
I have one question. I think we'll wrap up with this. Take you back to the beginning of your project. You mentioned early on that when you first came to AAS in the fall of 2016, you knew some of the basic milestones of her life, but then you wanted to fill that in.
Yeah.
How did you first learn about Betsy Stockton at all? What led you to her story at the beginning?
Well, I have to credit my wife here. We go to Princeton frequently. Our daughter and grandchildren live there. And one day Ann was sitting on the Richard Stockton bench on the campus, drifted down into the black neighborhood where there was a Betsy Stockton plaque out in front of the church. She said, Stockton, you ought to look into this. And there had been, I have to say, a number of scholarly or near scholarly articles about Betsy Stockton in historical journals and encyclopedias. I read those. I began to realize there's something missing here, or maybe something not quite right, that there's a better story to be told than what they were telling. And so with that basic framework, I came here and started looking for other kinds of evidence, other kinds of stories about her, and other kinds of ways to tell her story. And I have to say, I think there are probably many ways to tell her story. I've written one. Anybody else is welcome to some others.
That's a challenge for us all. It's also a testament to the work of a historian who thinks outside the boxes, who enables us to see lives that have been at least neglected by mainstream culture, though not neglected in her own community.
Yeah.
And for that, Greg Nobles, we thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
and
you
thanks
for being
all
here.
of you very much.
I'd like to thank you all for joining us here this evening. I want to tell you about a couple of programs we have coming up in the next month. Next week, next Thursday night, Jacqueline Jones will be here to give the Barren Lecture here at AAS. The Barren Lecture is a lecture in which a scholar reflects upon a book that they may have written decades earlier and what has happened in the decades since that book. Jackie Jones wrote a book called Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family from Slavery to the Present, which won the Bancroft Prize in American History in the mid-1980s. She'll be here next week to talk about how that book looks to her 30-on years later. And then in November, on November 10th, the printer and publisher David Godine will be here talking about his career in printing. And the week after that, on November 17th, a group of Worcester Black poets will be here at AAS reflecting upon one of the collections we have here. It's a collection of the Brown family, who are an African-American family in Worcester who dates back to the early 19th century. So it's really a conversation about that collection with people who are writing poetry now in the African-American community. So please join us for those programs. You can watch this program or many of our other programs on our YouTube channel. Please check that out. And for now, Thank you so much to Greg Nobles.
Thanks.
To all of you, have a wonderful evening.